Before becoming one of the most admired emperors by classical historians, even though largely overlooked by the modern public, Antoninus Pius was merely another discrete name in the long and intricate Roman aristocracy. Born on the 11th of September in the year 86, after Christ Muster, in Lanuvium, an ancient city in Latium located southeast of Rome, his full name at the time was Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus, a lineage that already hinted at the union between tradition and moderation. Son of Iuta Titus Aurelius Fulvus, a prestigious consul and politician, and of Iuus Aria Fadilla, Antoninus descended from a senatorial family that, although not among the most powerful, enjoyed prestige and respectability, with deep roots both in the heart of the Italian peninsula and in the traditions of public service. Educated with the same rigor that shaped the men of the Roman elite, he was instructed in the foundations of rhetoric, philosophy, and jurisprudence within a family environment guided by values of restraint, dignity, and loyalty to the state. From a very young age, Antoninus displayed a characteristic that would mark his entire path, an instinctive aversion to excess and self-promotion. While other members of the elite pursued military fame, populist prestige, or inflamed senatorial disputes, he preferred the path of institutional solidity, the role of the meticulous administrator, and the honor of silent duty. His behavior, always described as balanced and prudent, led him to ascend to the position of quaestor, then praetor, and later consul, without the scandals or shady alliances that typically tainted these stages of the Roman cursus honorum. He was a man of simple habits, deeply devoted to his home, his wife, Faustina the elder, and the public duties he fulfilled with diligence. More than that, he was a living example of the Roman ideal of pietas, devotion to duty, family, and the gods, a virtue that would become one of the central pillars of his rule. After the consulate, Antoninus was appointed proconsul of the province of Asia, one of the richest and most strategic regions of the Roman Empire. There, his administration caught the attention of none other than Emperor Hadrian, who was looking for someone capable of managing administrative tensions without provoking new internal or external upheavals. The way Antoninus conducted his governance in Asia, marked by efficiency, moderation in public spending, and justice applied with sound judgment, not only solidified his reputation, but also placed him on the radar of supreme power. In an empire weary of extravagance, bloody wars, and unstable emperors, the figure of a sober aristocrat, faithful to the principles of the mos maiorum and endowed with rare emotional balance, began to shine on the Roman political horizon, not for his military prowess, but for something much rarer, his reliability. It was in this context that Antoninus unexpectedly found himself thrust into the center of the most complex dynastic game in Imperial Roman history. In his final years, Hadrian Charles, gravely ill and unpopular among many members of the Senate, sought to ensure the continuity of his reformist agenda and the stability of the throne after his death. Hadrian's initial choice, Lucius Aelius Caesar, died unexpectedly at the beginning of the year 138 after Christ, leaving a power vacuum that could plunge Rome into new chaos. Into this vacuum stepped Antoninus Pius, but his appointment did not come without conditions. Hadrian imposed a dual clause, requiring Antoninus to adopt two young men, Marcus Aurelius, his great-nephew, and Jew Lucius Verus, the son of Aelius, as future successors. The selection was not merely an honor, but a sophisticated political maneuver, where Antoninus would serve as a trustworthy link between two generations, a guardian of peaceful transition amid latent instability. By accepting Hadrian's condition, Antoninus sealed his fate as emperor. However, unlike his predecessors, he did not enter Rome as a conqueror nor as a usurper. He entered as a man of duty, called not by the clamor of the legions or popular pressure, but by the trust of a dying emperor and the endorsement of the Senate. His title of Pius, granted later, was not merely rhetorical ornamentation. It was recognition of his loyalty to the deceased emperor, whom he defended posthumously, even against senatorial resistance, and of his extreme dedication to Roman order. The term pious should not be interpreted only as pious, but as one who honors commitments to the dead, to the gods, and to the republic, a definition that Antoninus would embody until his final breath. This first block closes with the image of a man who never sought the throne, but who, upon accepting it, redefined what it meant to govern Rome. Without epic battles, fiery speeches, or self-promotional campaigns, Antoninus Pius demonstrated that the strength of an empire can also reside in the silence of good governance, in just administration, and in the constancy of small reforms. In the next block, we will explore the fun behind the scenes of Hadrian's adoption decision, the power plays that preceded his rise, and how the Antonine dynasty's dynastic project became one of the greatest political innovations in the Roman world. In the year 138 after Christ, the vastest empire of antiquity stood at a silent yet dangerous crossroads. Hadrian, the traveling, reformist, and often contested emperor, languished in his final days, consumed by a painful illness and the certainty that his death could unleash the very chaos he had feared throughout his reign. Since the death of Trajan, Rome had lived under the weight of succession instability, and Hadrian, obsessed with preserving his legacy and the imperial order, knew that his final decision would define not only his memory, but the future of Roman civilization. His first attempt to ensure a safe transition had been the adoption of Lucius Aelius Caesar, a man of reasonable political skill, but whose fragile health and lack of military charisma worried both the emperor and the Senate. When Aelius died suddenly on the 1st of January of that same year, Hadrian found himself staring into an abyss. Rome was left without a clear heir, time was short, and the political elite began to grow restless at the signs of power vacancy. That was when Antoninus emerged, not as a hero in arms nor as an ambitious tribune, but as a man of solid reputation, austere life, and irreproachable conduct. Antoninus had no faction, had caused no scandals, and showed no thirst for power. Precisely because of this, he was the ideal name. For Hadrian, tormented by decades of conflict with the Senate, and marked by his repression of the Jews in Judea, choosing a trustworthy successor capable of conciliation and maintaining stability was more than a political strategy. It was a bid for redemption. In Antoninus he saw the kind of ruler he himself had not fully managed to be: moderate, beloved, steady, and less prone to the imperial passions that had stained so many biographies. The decision was officially sealed on the 25th of February, when Hadrian announced to the Senate and the Roman people that Antoninus would be his adopted son, and thus his legal heir. However, this adoption did not come alone. In a gesture of rare political complexity, Hadrian imposed a double condition. Antoninus must, in turn, adopt two young men: Marcus Aurelius, his great-nephew and philosophical protege, and Lucius Verus, biological son of Aelius Caesar. In doing so, the emperor not only secured a succession line encompassing 3 generations, but also created a system of successors capable of balancing Rome's various political, familial, and ideological interests. This was an unprecedented innovation. For the first time, an emperor named not only one, but 2 indirect successors, establishing a layered dynastic project, with Antoninus as the central pillar of transition. It was Hadrian's bet on a future of continuity, not rupture. The interpretation of this choice still divides historians today. To some, it was a masterstroke. Antoninus was experienced, beloved, and embodied all the moral attributes valued by the Mos Maiorum. To others, it revealed the desperation of an isolated Hadrian, lacking more vigorous options, who resorted to a docile senator to keep his political agenda alive after death. Regardless of intent, the fact remains that Antoninus accepted the burden with the same spirit that had always guided his public life, with honor, without visible ambition, but with absolute commitment to the role. He imposed no conditions, did not bargain with the Senate, and did not alter the original pact. Instead, he swore an oath to Hadrian's memory, promising to honor him even after death, a gesture that would earn him the title Pius, the ultimate symbol of his fidelity to the adoption commitments and the designs of the deceased emperor. This transition, achieved without civil war, palace assassinations, or legion uprisings, marked a singular moment in Roman history. For the first time in decades, the empire witnessed a peaceful succession process, carefully orchestrated and accepted by both the senatorial elite and the people. Antoninus assumed the principate at the age of 42, at the height of his intellectual and administrative maturity. Unlike his predecessors, he promoted no purges, retaliated against no rivals, and did not reshape the empire according to a personal ideology. He chose instead to be the guardian of continuity, the man who did not break with Hadrian, but who was also not bound by him. In his first public declaration as emperor, he reaffirmed his commitment to stability and justice, avoiding grand promises or displays of force. Antoninus also acted firmly to protect Hadrian's legacy, which had become the target of intense Senate criticism after his death. Many senators demanded that the new emperor let his predecessor fade into oblivion, or even be condemned to damnatio memoriae, the symbolic erasure from history. Antoninus, however, intervened with vigor. He fought for Hadrian's deification, organized his funeral ceremonies with grandeur, and ensured that his memory was preserved in imperial records. It was this gesture, of profound loyalty even in the face of the deceased's unpopularity, that led the Senate to bestow upon him the title Pius, thus establishing the image that would endure for centuries, that of the faithful emperor, balanced and committed to the highest values of Roman civility. In short, Hadrian's decision to name Antoninus Pius was not merely a political act. It was a calculated gesture, but also a desperate attempt to restore a model of government based on virtue, continuity, and wisdom. By accepting the conditions and embracing the double adoption of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, Antoninus took on not just the throne, but the burden of an empire in need of peace, not only at its frontiers, but in the soul of its leadership. The Roman world, accustomed to charismatic emperors, brutal generals, or dangerous eccentrics, was about to discover the value of a ruler who was silent, yet unshakable. In the next block, we will delve into the official beginning of his reign and examine how Antoninus, now emperor, built his authority in dialogue with the Senate, consolidating one of the most stable periods in all of Roman history. The rise of Antoninus Pius to the imperial throne represented one of the smoothest and most institutionally balanced transitions in Rome's long and tumultuous history. When the Senate confirmed his appointment in the year 138 after Christ, following Hadrian's death, many expected a new cycle of tensions, brutal adjustments, or retaliations against the enemies of the previous regime. However, what followed was the almost imperceptible establishment of a new government, as calm as the personality of its new leader. Antoninus did not proclaim a new era, did not launch theatrical reforms, and did not treat the Senate as either enemy or obstacle. On the contrary, he embraced it as a partner in statecraft, restoring a relationship that had been strained under Hadrian and reinforcing the principles of the old res publica, even in an empire already largely centralized. From the very beginning, Antoninus understood that his legitimacy did not come solely from the adoption by Hadrian, but from the trust he could build among the senators, magistrates, military officers, and above all, the Roman people. With this understanding, he adopted a deliberately respectful stance toward the Senate, refusing to govern by authoritarian decree whenever possible, and instead seeking to involve the senatorial body in the empire's major decisions. This attitude was not merely symbolic, it was an essential part of his strategy for institutional pacification. Unlike previous emperors who viewed the Senate as either a decorative appendage or a potential threat, Antoninus Pius promoted a true culture of consultation, listening, and cooperation. With every public statement, he reinforced that his role was that of a princeps, first among equals, and not that of an absolute monarch. This posture also had immediate effects on civil administration and the stability of the state apparatus. Antoninus avoided mass replacements in government positions, preserving the qualified administrative staff left by Hadrian and reducing the tensions that typically accompanied regime changes. This administrative continuity allowed the empire to function smoothly, without logistical ruptures, standstills, or mistrust among provincial governors. Moreover, Antoninus made it a point to honor Hadrian's promises and complete the public works that were already underway, reinforcing the perception of a government committed to stability and the fulfillment of responsibilities. This commitment to institutional continuity was one of the pillars of his regime's legitimacy and one of the reasons his reign would be so admired by future generations. Another gesture that solidified his image as a moderate emperor was his refusal to live extravagantly. He remained on the Palatine Hill, did not build monumental palaces for himself, and did not engage in unnecessary public expenditures. Instead, he focused on restoring temples, aqueducts, and essential administrative systems for the empire's functioning. His reforms were not announced in public squares, nor accompanied by imperial celebrations. They occurred behind the scenes, with the silent efficiency of a ruler who viewed effective administration as a higher form of glory. This choice had a profound impact on public perception. Antoninus was seen not as a tyrant or general, but as a true curator of the Roman state, an emperor who ruled with his eyes fixed on the lasting welfare of the polis, not on his own political immortality. Internally, his relationship with municipal magistrates and high provincial authorities was marked by respect and balance. He decentralized certain decisions to allow for greater regional autonomy, but always demanded strict accountability. He created fairer tax collection mechanisms, especially in the most exploited provinces, and promoted more rational use of the empire's resources. Under his leadership, the Roman bureaucracy became less prone to corruption, not because the system had been reformed at its core, but because the emperor's personal example directly influenced administrative habits. Antoninus's moral authority was such that many governors simply imitated his behavior, treating their roles as sacred duties rather than opportunities for enrichment. Antoninus's moderation also extended to his penal policy. While other emperors used exemplary punishments to maintain order and project strength, Antoninus believed in justice as a tool of stability, not intimidation. He intervened several times in trials deemed unjust, overturning arbitrary convictions, reducing excessive penalties, and reaffirming Roman legal principles as instruments of civilization, not tools of state vengeance. It was during his reign that many legal decisions began to consider more closely the individual circumstances of the accused, an evolution that would influence centuries of jurisprudence. In Rome, and across the foundations of modern Western law, it is impossible to understand the silent strength of Antoninus's reign without highlighting the symbolic weight of his loyalty to the Senate. In times of mutual distrust between emperors and the aristocracy, Antoninus offered a new synthesis, that of the emperor who did not need fear to govern. His authority was respected because it was legitimate, and his legitimacy came from mutual respect. The result was a long, stable reign, almost entirely free of palace conspiracies or coup attempts. Not even the military, so often the source of instability in previous reigns, showed dissatisfaction. Antoninus respected them, ensured their pay, kept the borders well defended, and at the same time avoided engaging them in unnecessary wars that might cause internal unrest. Thus, the transition from senator to emperor did not mark a rupture in Antoninus's life, but rather a natural extension of his service to the Republic. His transformation into emperor was more an evolution of function than a change of essence. He remained the same man of measured habits, calm speech, and thoughtful decisions, only now with absolute power. And perhaps that is precisely why his authority was so effective, because it did not arise from fear but from trust, not from spectacle but from constancy, not from war but from peace. In the next block, we will explore in depth the peaceful reign of Antoninus Pius, analyzing how he managed to keep all the empire's frontiers stable for 23 years without initiating a single war of conquest, an extraordinary feat in Roman military history. When Antoninus Pius assumed the imperial throne in the year 138 after Christ, Rome stood at the height of its territorial expansion, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the forested frontiers of Germania, from the sands of the Sahara to the icy rivers of Britannia. The vastness of the territory represented not only accumulated glory, but also a monumental logistical challenge. Every frontier, every wall, every militarized road required vigilance, maintenance, and swift response to any hint of rebellion or invasion. Historical precedent was clear. Emperors like Trajan had responded to such tensions with wars of conquest, while others, like Hadrian, had preferred retraction and fortification. Antoninus, however, chose a rarely followed path, one of sustained peace, not through omission, but through vigilant diplomacy and a firm state presence. During his 23-year reign, Antoninus initiated no external war. There were no expansionist campaigns, no triumphal marches, no sackings of new provinces. Yet the emperor was not a naive pacifist. He understood that the empire required firm defense, but he rejected the human, financial, and institutional cost of unnecessary wars. Rather than seeking military glory, he focused on reinforcing border defenses, improving legion training, and consolidating local alliances, especially with frontier tribes that could act either as threats or as buffers against external invaders. This preventative approach proved decisive for the prolonged period of stability that Rome experienced under his rule. One emblematic example of this stance was the situation on the northern frontiers of Britannia. While Hadrian had ordered the construction of his famous wall to hold back the Picts and other northern tribes, Antoninus decided to extend that defensive line, ordering the construction of the so-called Antonine Wall. Further north in what is now Scotland, though eventually abandoned, the structure was not an act of aggression, but rather a clear message of presence and control. More than that, the wall was accompanied by fortified outposts and a redesign of the region's military roads, enabling quicker and more coordinated responses to tribal movements. It was not a disguised invasion, but an active defensive strategy that made it clear Rome was attentive and present. In the eastern frontier zones, especially with the Parthian Empire, the situation was even more delicate. Any rash action could reignite a costly and prolonged war. Antoninus opted for a policy of balance. He sent diplomatic missions, maintained well-placed spies, and offered commercial and territorial guarantees, as long as order was respected. The Parthians, aware of Roman strength and preoccupied with their own internal problems, responded favorably to Antoninus's approach, and for more than 2 decades, the frontiers of the Euphrates remained stable. This feat becomes even more remarkable when considering that conflicts would erupt shortly after his death, proving that his peace was not the result of luck, but of active management. In North Africa, where occasional uprisings and nomadic incursions often destabilized productive regions of the empire, Antoninus used a combination of administrative reforms, rewards for cooperative tribes, and targeted military actions, always with the aim of pacifying without escalating. The same approach was applied in the Danubian provinces, where he reorganized legion positions and improved supply routes, ensuring that any insurrection could be quelled before evolving into a larger conflict. Military intelligence became a central tool of his reign. Rather than relying solely on brute force, the emperor prioritized the constant reports, networks of local informants, and updated maps of external movements, allowing him to anticipate crises before they erupted. It is no surprise that later Roman historians would call the reign of Antoninus Pius a forgotten golden age. His accomplishments were quiet, yet profound. The absence of war did not mean inaction, but rather a continuous and often invisible effort to maintain balance. This required daily negotiations, diplomatic listening, investments in military logistics, and, above all, a solid central government that inspired confidence in both allies and potential enemies. The peace under Antoninus was not a gift from the gods, but a human, political, and calculated construction. Lastly, it is important to highlight that the choice not to engage in war also had direct economic implications. Without the colossal expenses of military campaigns, involving the movement of thousands of soldiers, supplies, armaments, construction of mobile fortifications, and post-conflict indemnities, the imperial treasury could be redirected toward infrastructure, justice, culture, and administration. Under Antoninus, Rome experienced internal flourishing precisely because it looked inward, not outward. And ironically, this introspection guaranteed one of the empire's greatest strengths, its territorial cohesion. In the next block, we will explore one of the most admirable aspects of his reign, the legal reforms promoted by Antoninus, which solidified his reputation as a jurist emperor, defender of justice, legal rationality, and human dignity within the Roman legal system. In the vast pantheon of Roman emperors, few understood the civilizing role of law as profoundly as Antoninus Pius. In an empire where military glory was often more celebrated than legal virtues, Antoninus distinguished himself not by victories on the battlefield, but by his unwavering commitment as a guardian of justice, reformer of the legal system, and defender of rational and balanced governance. His legacy as a jurist emperor was not built upon grandiose laws or revolutionary codes. but through everyday decisions, judicial opinions, and governance grounded in equity and common sense. For Antoninus, law was a living expression of reason and order, and to govern justly was the highest form of preserving the Pax Romana, not only on the frontiers, but at the heart of human relations. From his earliest days as emperor, Antoninus dealt with legal petitions personally, often responding directly to disputes submitted by citizens, communities, and magistrates from across the empire. These imperial rescripts, documents issuing opinions on legal questions, became fundamental instruments for the refinement and standardization of Roman law. One of the most notable aspects of his jurisprudence was his constant effort to balance the strict letter of the law with compassion for human circumstances. Antoninus intervened to prevent abuses of power, overturned decisions based on arbitrary interpretations, and expanded jurisprudence to protect traditionally marginalized groups, such as orphans, women, minors, and even certain enslaved individuals. His view of justice was not utopian, but deeply practical. Antoninus understood that, in an empire so diverse and vast, the uniform application of law was the invisible thread that held the Roman social fabric together. For this reason, he encouraged the development of experienced jurists in the provinces, supported the systematization of forensic practices, and endorsed the legal decisions of local governors, provided they were grounded in equity. It was during his reign that the use of Toph Epieikeia, the principle of equity, inherited from Stoic philosophy and Greek legal tradition, became a legitimate interpretive criterion for judges. Rather than blind application of rules, Antoninus preferred decisions guided by the greater good, substantive justice, and collective harmony, principles that would later influence canon law and the foundations of Western natural law theory. Their famous example of his role as a jurist emperor was his ruling in favor of the freedom of enslaved individuals who had been abused by their masters. Although traditional Roman law recognized the dominus's absolute authority over their servants, Antoninus asserted that deliberate cruelty and extreme abuse invalidated such power and justified judicial emancipation. This decision not only challenged centuries of legal custom, but introduced into imperial jurisprudence the idea of a minimum dignity applicable even to those at the base of the social hierarchy. In another case, Antoninus ruled that orphans could not be forced to assume their parents' debts without individualized judicial review, preventing children from being ruined by mismanaged inheritances. These actions demonstrated not only technical legal knowledge, but a deeply ethical philosophy of governance, where the emperor saw himself as the final protector of the wronged, the last barrier between the arbitrary power of the elite and the security of ordinary citizens. Antoninus did not believe in legal revolutions, but in quiet reforms that accumulated over time created a more stable, just, and predictable system. Justice under his rule was not a tool of domination, but a pillar of internal peace, a civilizing element essential to Roman order. This conception was reflected in all layers of public life, in court proceedings, in senatorial decrees, in provincial edicts, and in the letters sent to governors. The importance of this legal stability cannot be overstated. In a world where most of the population was illiterate, where the distances between provinces and the capital could take months to cross, and where administrative abuses were frequent, the very possibility of appealing directly to the emperor was a form of psychological and social security. And Antoninus took these appeals seriously. His legal office operated continuously, analyzing petitions, drafting rescripts, and issuing responses based on consistent precedents. Through this, he created a cohesive legal body that strengthened the sense of justice among the Roman peoples, while solidifying the image of the emperor as supreme arbiter, but not tyrant. For all these reasons, Antoninus Pius is remembered by later jurists as a true model of a legislator-emperor, not because he created a new legal code, but because he cultivated a culture of legality, prudence, and legal compassion. His rescripts were cited for centuries, and in the great compilation of Roman law assembled by Justinian, many of Antoninus's rulings were preserved as models of legal reasoning and ethical balance. His work as supreme judge did not merely resolve conflicts, it transmitted values that, though forgotten by many of his successors, still resonate in the foundations of modern legal thought. In the next block, we will dive into another profoundly human aspect of his government, his social measures to protect the most vulnerable, women, orphans, and enslaved individuals, and how he used legislation to build a fairer empire, starting with the most overlooked margins of society. In the vastness of the Roman Empire, where laws often favored the powerful and social structures legitimized immutable hierarchies, the reign of Antoninus Pius stood as an exception by extending the hand of the state to the most vulnerable of the social pyramid. Enslaved persons, orphans, and women, groups that had historically occupied subordinate and often invisible roles in the legal and institutional fabric of Rome, became, under his rule, recipients of special attention, direct beneficiaries of legal and administrative reforms aimed at curbing abuse, protecting the defenseless, and guaranteeing a minimum dignity even at the lowest strata of society. These actions, silent in their time, would resonate deeply in later legal traditions and solidify Antoninus as one of the most humanistic emperors in Roman history. Regarding enslaved individuals, Antoninus initiated a transformation that, though subtle, had a direct impact on how the slave system was administered. Roman law until then had treated enslaved persons as res mobiles, movable property without any recognition of legal personality. The master's word was supreme, and there was no recourse against punishment, exploitation, or death. Antoninus, however, began a gradual legal humanization of slavery, recognizing in some cases the right of enslaved individuals to defend themselves against abuse and allowing through imperial rescripts certain slaves to appeal to magistrates or imperial procurators when exposed to extreme violence. This initiative, while neither abolishing slavery nor changing its structural foundations, broke with centuries of absolute impunity and affirmed that even property ownership did not grant unlimited power over another human life. Antoninus's policy went beyond suppressing individual abuses. It sought to structure institutional instruments of protection. In some provinces, he authorized the creation of administrative offices functioning as imperial ombudsmen, dedicated to hearing complaints from enslaved individuals or freedmen, especially in cases involving threats to life or physical integrity. He also decreed that slaves could not be sold without prior medical examinations to ensure minimal health conditions, preventing masters from passing off terminally ill individuals as healthy servants. These seemingly technical measures reveal a sophisticated understanding of the mechanisms of oppression and a genuine effort to regulate them from within, limiting systemic harm without provoking a direct collapse, which would have been politically unfeasible at the time. In the realm of orphan protection, Antoninus elevated the responsibility of the state toward children who had lost their parents, especially in an era when the absence of a Roman father often meant near total abandonment. Since the time of Trajan, there had existed alimenta, or programs, public initiatives for food aid and economic support for poor children. Antoninus expanded these programs by increasing funding, reorganizing distribution, and implementing stronger oversight to prevent embezzlement. He also instituted the role of orphan curator in various provinces, a public agent tasked with overseeing the assets and education of minors, with legal authority to challenge abusive inheritances, demand accountability from guardians, and take judicial action on behalf of the ward. This legal figure, innovative for its time, offered many orphans a shield against greedy relatives, neglectful guardians, and local corruption. Women, though not granted full rights nor free from the legal constraints of Roman patriarchy, found in Antoninus a ruler attuned to the fee-specific vulnerabilities of the female condition. He reformed marriage laws, created mechanisms for quicker restitution of dowries in divorce cases, and ruled that no woman could be forced to marry against her will, especially when under state guardianship. Additionally, he reinforced the validity of high female testaments, allowing widows and wealthy matrons to dispose of their property with greater autonomy, provided they respected Roman inheritance laws. These changes, though modest by modern standards, legally consolidated the status of women as civil subjects, and not merely as appendages of male authority. Antoninus also intervened in cases where women had been victims of sexual violence, establishing that a woman's honor could not be judged solely by her social status, but by the circumstances and available testimony. In documented rulings, he overturned previous sentences in which enslaved women had been blamed for acts committed by their aggressors, officially recognizing, for the first time, the impossibility of consent within slavery. This set precedents that would later be used by jurists to soften the principle of guilt in abuse cases. Antoninus Pius's actions in these three domains, slavery, orphanhood, and female guardianship, were not driven by ideological revolt, but by a profound ethic of governance, which saw the empire not merely as a machine of conquest, but as a moral community. By protecting the weakest, Antoninus did not threaten the social foundations. He reinforced them, building a fabric of trust that reduced rebellions, consolidated provincial loyalty, and demonstrated that even in its vastness, the empire could be just and compassionate. More than that, he offered history a rare example of power moderated by empathy, an emperor who legislated not to impress senators or legions, but to protect the invisible. In the next block, we will explore the physical dimension of this imperial justice, the public works, monuments, roads, and aqueducts ordered by Antoninus, not as symbols of power, but as permanent structures for collective well-being. While many Roman emperors sought eternity through triumphal columns, marble arches, and temples of colossal proportions, Antoninus Pius left to posterity a legacy built with a different ambition, to lay stone upon stone for the common good, not for personal glory. His reign, though devoid of spectacular wars or campaigns of conquest, was one of the most fruitful in terms of public infrastructure, encompassing not only Rome, but also the most remote provinces of the empire. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, bathhouses, granaries, silos, and irrigation systems were built or restored on a massive scale as part of a quiet but profound plan of Roman daily life re-engineering, whose impact would be felt far beyond his time. Antoninus understood that peace, to be real, needed physical foundations. Cities connected by well-built roads prosper more quickly. Regions supplied by aqueducts fall sick less often. Rural markets reached by bridges and transport roads become richer and more organized. His approach was practical, almost mathematical. He did not seek artistic grandeur, nor did he engrave his image onto every stone. What he did was invest, with both personal funds and public treasury, in engineering projects that ensured mobility, supply, and sanitation for millions of inhabitants stretching from the Nile to Caledonia. And he did so through logistical coordination so efficient that it would inspire admiration in generations of administrators and engineers to come. One of the most notable projects of his administration was the reform and extension of the imperial road system, especially in the regions of Gaul, Pannonia, Syria, and Mauritania. Antoninus oversaw the creation of new commercial and military routes, paved with advanced techniques and lined with supply stations that included inns, water fountains, supply depots, and even small workshops. These roads did not merely facilitate legion movements, they economically integrated previously isolated regions, enabling faster circulation of goods, ideas, news, and imperial orders. The empire, under his direction, became more compact, more agile, and more functional, without resorting to violence or aggressive imperial propaganda. Another pillar of his public policy was urban sanitation. Antoninus committed himself to expanding and maintaining aqueduct systems not only in Rome, where a complex network already existed, but also in provincial cities such as Lugdunum, Antioch, Alexandria, and Carthage. He restored damaged conduits, built new reservoirs, reinforced distribution channels, and expanded public baths. The result was a significant improvement in urban public health, reflected in the reduction of epidemic outbreaks and an increase in life expectancy, especially among the lower classes. These investments in sanitary infrastructure demonstrated that, for Antoninus, the true greatness of an empire lay in its ability to care for the collective body, not just its reflection on coins. Equally significant was his work in reconstructing areas affected by natural disasters. Earthquakes, floods, and fires were common across the vast Roman world. When such calamities struck cities like Smyrna or Syrian and Egyptian towns along the eastern Mediterranean, Antoninus quickly mobilized engineers, auxiliary troops, and imperial funds to rebuild. not through improvisation but with solid engineering methods based on topographic surveys and urban planning. Many of these cities were reborn with better infrastructure than before the disaster. The emperor made it a point not only to restore but to modernize, reaffirming Rome's role as the maintainer of the material order of the world. In Rome, although his presence was more discreet than that of his predecessors, Antoninus also left lasting marks. He reconstructed parts of Trajan's Forum, restored the Pantheon, and ordered improvements to the ports of the Tiber, optimizing the flow of goods and the safety of vessels. Additionally, he built a mausoleum for his wife, Faustina the Elder, transforming it into a temple after her death and deification, what would later be known as the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, one of the few imperial monuments that still stand in Rome as a visible testimony to his memory. More than raising stones, Antoninus knew how to structure imperial space with administrative intelligence, ensuring that the empire did not merely exist, but functioned as a coherent, cohesive, and well-supplied organism. His infrastructure policy was, at its core, a state policy. By improving physical connections, he reduced the psychological and cultural distances between center and periphery. This integration, subtle but effective, kept the Roman fabric cohesive for decades after his death, proving that Rome's true conquest was not just over territories, but over networks of stone, of water, of justice, and of humanity. In the next block, we will explore another equally essential aspect of his governance, his religious policy and Antoninus's relationship with traditional cults, foreign rites, and the early Christians, revealing the emperor as an architect not only of physical bridges but also of spiritual ones. In a Rome where syncretism was the norm, but imperial oversight of religious expression never ceased to exist, the reign of Antoninus Pius stood out for a rare balance between respect for tradition and openness to spiritual diversity. In an empire where the gods of the Capitoline coexisted with Egyptian rites, Persian mysteries, Greek philosophies, and the early manifestations of Christianity, the way the emperor approached collective religiosity was as strategic as it was symbolic. His religious policy was not marked by dramatic reforms or systematic persecutions, but by managed tolerance, a kind of imperial secularism that ensured peace among beliefs, as long as none of them threatened civic order or state authority. Antoninus Pius was, above all, a defender of Rome's traditional religious practices, and he was initiated into various priestly orders, such as the Salii, the Augurs, and the Pontifices, publicly demonstrating his commitment to the rites that, since the Republic, had defined the relationship between the state and the gods. He understood that public religiosity, the processions, the sacrifices, the festive dates, were more than devotion. They were instruments of social cohesion and symbolic stability. Thus, he sponsored the restoration of ancient temples, kept the festival calendars intact, and encouraged the teaching of Roman myths and cults in rhetoric and grammar schools. However, his commitment to orthodoxy never turned into hostility toward alternative beliefs, flourishing on the empire's margins. On the contrary, Antoninus knew that a cohesive empire was also a spiritually plural one. His stance toward Eastern religions, such as Mithraism, the Isiac cults, and Syrian practices, was one of notable moderation. As long as these practices did not challenge public morality or create sects antagonistic to the imperial cult, they were tolerated and, in many cases, incorporated into urban life with the support of local magistrates. Antoninus understood that, especially in the eastern provinces, regional cults offered meaning and belonging to millions of subjects, and that repressing them would be counterproductive. He authorized the construction of temples to Serapis, allowed processions to Cybele, and recognized Mithraic priests in several cities in Asia Minor and Pannonia. This openness was not driven by personal adherence, but by an administrative intelligence that saw religious plurality as an ally, not an enemy. Perhaps the most sensitive and commented aspect of his religious policy was his relationship with the Christians, whose presence was already being felt in various provinces and even in Rome. Unlike previous emperors, who viewed them with suspicion or persecuted them as enemies of the state, Antoninus adopted a stance of restraint and reasonableness. In a famous rescript addressed to the authorities of Asia, the emperor stated that Christians should not be persecuted merely for bearing the name. but only if they were in fact violating civil laws or disturbing public order. This position did not equate to the acceptance of Christianity, but represented a milestone of legal tolerance, recognizing that not every religious dissent was necessarily a political betrayal. The decision not to actively persecute Christians had profound implications. Under his reign, there were fewer martyrdoms, more tolerated assemblies, and stable growth of Christian communities, especially in regions like North Africa, Syria, and Greece. Many later historians view this as a sign of pragmatism. Antoninus knew that violently repressing what could not be extinguished would only inflame tensions and create martyrs. By allowing Christian communities to operate as long as they maintained public order, the emperor avoided conflict and gained time that Christianity would use to grow silently, consolidating its doctrinal and institutional network in the underground levels of imperial society. This policy of spiritual balance was also reflected in how Antoninus respected philosophy as a religious dimension of the Roman elite. He valued philosophical schools such as Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Middle Platonism, recognizing in them not only abstract knowledge, but also legitimate forms of rational spirituality. His relationship with Marcus Aurelius, deeply influenced by Stoicism and with Greek thinkers, made the imperial court of Antoninus a center of elevated syncretism, where reason and faith walked side by side, without direct antagonism. Under his leadership, there was no room for persecutory dogmas. There was space for the harmony between ancestral cult and the philosophical spirit of a new era. Finally, it is essential to understand that Antoninus viewed religion as an instrument of pacification, not imposition. His ability to maintain religious stability in an empire that housed thousands of gods and hundreds of simultaneous cults was one of the reasons his government enjoyed such enduring internal peace. He understood that the city's altars were mirrors of the collective soul, and that the destruction of a temple meant more than the loss of a building. It was the collapse of a worldview, of a history, of a sense of belonging. That is why he chose to preserve, to dialogue, to expand, and to allow, without ever letting religious freedom become a challenge to order. In the next block, we will dive into the philosophical ideas that influenced his reign, especially Stoicism, and how this school of thought shaped not only Antoninus, but also his heir Marcus Aurelius, building a dynasty supported not only by laws and monuments, but by rational ethics. Although Antoninus Pius left no philosophical writings and is not traditionally remembered as a thinker, his reign was deeply shaped by the intellectual and moral environment of Stoicism, which permeated the Roman elite of the 2nd century after Christ. The influence of this philosophical school manifested not only in speeches and treatises, but primarily in the practical ethics of power, in the restraint of impulses, in the duty to govern with reason, and in the ideal of moral cosmopolitanism that guided the relationship between ruler and ruled. Antoninus, with his reserved temperament, balanced domestic life, love of justice, and constant rejection of excess, embodied Stoic principles not as a declared dogma, but as a lived conduct. And it is precisely in this silence that his philosophical greatness lies. Stoicism, since the times of Seneca and Epictetus, had become one of the most respected currents among cultured Romans, offering a worldview grounded in reason, acceptance of fate, the logos, and the practice of virtue as the highest good. This philosophy taught that men should not be slaves to their passions, that power must be exercised wisely, and that the good life was one lived in harmony with nature and universal reason. Antoninus, though not an author like his successor Marcus Aurelius, was the most complete political example of this tradition. An emperor who ruled as a guardian of the natural order, not as a tyrant driven by vanity or anger. The atmosphere of the court under Antoninus was notably influenced by Greek and Roman thinkers aligned with the Stoic and Platonic schools. His closeness to Marcus Aurelius, who was educated in the maxims of Epictetus and would later write the famous Meditations, reveals how deeply philosophical culture was cultivated as an essential part of imperial formation. Antoninus invested in hiring moral, rhetorical, and philosophical tutors not only for his heir, but also for the children of the senatorial elite, promoting an environment where civic virtue and upright character were not merely encouraged, They were expected. In this context, philosophy was not a scholarly pastime, but a tool of governance. Antoninus's refusal to launch unnecessary military campaigns, his dedication to justice, his patience with the Senate, his religious tolerance, and his moderation in imperial spending are attitudes that, seen through the lens of Stoicism, reveal themselves as cardinal virtues in action: prudence, temperance, moral courage, and justice. By governing without spectacle, avoiding inflammatory rhetoric, and focusing on maintaining order and fairness, Antoninus built a government that mirrored the philosophy guiding the best minds of his era. He was, in essence, the model of the princeps philosophus, not because he philosophized in public, but because he philosophized in the way he wielded power. It is also important to note that Stoicism preached the idea of a unified cosmos, where all human beings shared a common reason. This conception strongly influenced how Antoninus treated provincial peoples, regarding them as legitimate subjects rather than cultural inferiors. His concern for legality in the provinces, his respect for local traditions, and his integration policies through infrastructure and justice clearly reflect a Stoic cosmopolitan vision, in which the emperor is, above all, a citizen of the world tasked with maintaining the natural order among nations. One must also consider the symbolic weight of his death and succession within this philosophical context. Antoninus died peacefully, surrounded by family, and left a clear testament, transferring power to Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus in accordance with the original dynastic plan. No authoritarian maneuvers, no coups, no surprises. His calm and orderly end reflected the same spirit in which he had lived, with balance, without fear, without excess. He died as he lived, a just man, guided by reason, faithful to duty, and aware of the ephemerality of all human things. The Stoic portrait of a dignified death. In the next block, we will explore the economy of the empire under Antoninus, revealing how his fiscal prudence, balanced monetary management, and focus on internal growth allowed Antonine Rome to prosper without relying on plunder or inflation. The reign of Antoninus Pius represents, from an economic perspective, one of the most balanced, solid, and quietly successful phases in the entire history of the Roman Empire. In a world where military strength was often the main driver of revenue and emperors frequently resorted to currency devaluation to cover deficits, Antoninus followed a radically different path, one of stability, responsibility, and fiscal efficiency. Without expansionist wars, without major territorial conquests, without costly campaigns, he not only kept the imperial machine fully operational, but also ensured real and sustained economic growth, becoming a rare example of a statesman who enriched the empire without resorting to plunder or pillage. From the very beginning of his rule, Antoninus showed an acute awareness of the importance of financial soundness. Inheriting from Hadrian a relatively organized public treasury, he chose to preserve and expand this base without raising taxes or selling honors. Instead, he promoted the modernization of tax collection mechanisms, improving property registries, updating outdated fiscal rolls, and fighting administrative fraud through regular audits. Under his leadership, tax collectors were chosen based on technical merit rather than political influence, which led to significant gains in the efficiency of the tax system. Antoninus believed that good governance required not only the construction of bridges and aqueducts, but also keeping the treasury full sound without unduly burdening the citizens. In the monetary sphere, his most strategic decision was to keep the denarius stable in both weight and purity throughout his reign. While many of his predecessors and successors reduced the silver content of coins as a solution to uncontrolled expenses, Antoninus chose to preserve the currency's value as a symbol of confidence in the state. This decision had profound consequences. The imperial coin became a standard of value in the provinces, private credit flourished, and commercial contracts operated with greater predictability. Monetary stability created an ideal environment for the expansion of trade, both urban and rural, fostering the emergence of more robust local markets, especially in regions once considered peripheral to the empire, such as Dacia, northern Gaul, and parts of Roman Africa. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his economic policy was his emphasis on the strengthening of the internal market. With no wars to fuel the conquest engine, Antoninus turned his gaze inward and invested heavily in the economic integration of the provinces. He created incentives for agricultural production, supported regular fairs in strategic cities, funded the transport of grain between regions, and sponsored logistical improvements to the roads connecting commercial centers. The result was a more horizontal flow of wealth that linked farmers, artisans, merchants, and administrators in a cycle of mutual growth. Rather than concentrating revenue in Rome or in the hands of the Senate, Antoninus promoted a decentralized model of economic development that reinforced provincial loyalty and reduced dependency on the imperial center. His fiscal approach in the provinces also deserves recognition. Instead of imposing new taxes or intensifying the collection of late payments, Antoninus preferred negotiation. Cities that demonstrated good administration and political loyalty received benefits such as temporary exemptions, public works funding, or symbolic recognition. This model generated a kind of virtuous competition among urban centers, each striving to please the emperor and showcase their administrative efficiency. As a result, the empire collected more revenue without resorting to coercion, which reduced local revolts and cemented lasting alliances. It was a system that rewarded competence and valued dialogue between central power and regional elites. Antoninus also demonstrated concern for long-term fiscal predictability. Rather than spending all he collected to gain immediate prestige, he preferred to maintain reserves for future emergencies, creating an economic buffer that would prove vital decades later during the turbulent reigns of the 3rd century. His administration proved that it was possible to sustain the greatness of Rome not through costly military campaigns, but through sound management, public spirit, and a clear awareness of intergenerational responsibility. For him, governing meant protecting the present without compromising the future, and it was precisely this economic prudence that solidified Antoninus as a singular emperor, one who proved that peace and growth were not opposites, but could and should walk hand in hand. In the next section, we will explore the diplomatic and international relations of Antoninus Pius's reign, highlighting how he kept Rome's influence active in the world without resorting to war, through treaties, embassies, and a strategic network of alliances. In an empire where the distance between the throne and its subjects was measured in thousands of miles, and where most citizens would never see the emperor in the flesh, the image of the sovereign paradoxically became more important than his physical presence. Antoninus Pius, a man of discreet temperament and averse to theatricality, deeply understood this symbolic mechanism of Roman power. He knew that ruling well also meant being seen the right way, even from afar. In a world where imperial authority was consolidated not only by legions but also by coins, busts, altars, arches, and portraits scattered from Britannia to Judea, Antoninus skillfully built an imperial iconography centered on stability, continuity, and restored order, crucial elements for the psychological and political equilibrium of the 2nd century after Christ. Unlike emperors who sought to assert their image through theatrical gestures or military poses, Antoninus chose to convey a sense of serenity and predictability. His coins, minted in great variety throughout his long reign, reflect this symbolic choice. Rather than portraying himself in armor or triumphal scenes, as Trajan or Marcus Aurelius would later do, Antoninus often appears draped in togas, crowned by virtue, flanked by allegories of peace, equity, clemency, and justice. The monetary iconography of his government was a visual treatise on good governance, and simultaneously a constant reminder that the empire, under his rule, moved not by swords, but by laws. In this sense, the coin functioned like a silent newspaper, a means of communication between emperor and people, especially in the provinces where imperial presence was felt only through these small circles of silver or bronze. Beyond the coins, the busts and official portraits of Antoninus reinforced the same message. His visage, immortalized in marble across provincial capitals and local forums, depicted a man with serene features, a well-groomed beard, and a firm yet calm gaze, the very image of a Roman moderation. Romana, the beard which had become fashionable among emperors since Hadrian, was in Antoninus. More than an aesthetic, it was a symbol of philosophy, sobriety, reverence for Greek tradition, and distance from youthful impulses. His slightly tilted head, austere expression and upright posture suggested an emperor who ruled not with clenched fists, but with the calm authority of one who trusts in institutions and moral order. There was no exaggerated deification or Herculean musculature in his iconography. Antoninus was presented as human, just and accessible, yet worthy of reverence. This construction of his image was no accident. It was part of a symbolic strategy aimed at conveying hard continuity with previous emperors and security for present citizens. Antoninus often appeared alongside Faustina, his wife deified after her death, as a way to reinforce the legitimacy of his dynasty and promote an ideal of moral, familial, and civic unity. By associating himself with female figures and classical virtues, his image also became a tool of political pedagogy, teaching through symbols what the people expected of a ruler: stability, respect for tradition, clemency in the face of error, and justice in administration. The emperor ceased to be merely a military leader and became a moral mirror for the empire. This symbolic construction extended even to temples and monuments. The temple of Antoninus and Faustina, erected after his wife's death and later rededicated following his own deification, became the visible marker of a policy of continuity that spanned life and death. The imperial cult, far from being a display of vanity, was transformed into an instrument of cultural cohesion. Local populations, by worshipping Antoninus as Divus after his death, did not merely venerate a man. They revered an ideal of order, peace, and restored normalcy. The absence of conflicts during his reign made this symbolism even more essential. With no battles to celebrate, the empire celebrated its very ability to remain standing, stable, unshaken, like the image of its emperor. It is essential to understand, therefore, that Antoninus Pius was a master at using the symbolic tools of power with discretion and intelligence. He did not shout, he whispered. He did not impose, he inspired. His image, far from being a hollow piece of propaganda, was a tool of governance as effective as his decrees, his coins, and his buildings. In an empire so accustomed to the noise of war, Antoninus made silence a form of rule, and by sculpting his presence in stone and silver as a reflection of order and moderation, he became the archetype of the ruler whose actus governs not by fear, but by permanence. In the next section, we will explore how Antoninus dealt with diplomatic challenges and the empire's frontiers, maintaining Rome's global influence not through marching legions, but through treaties, alliances, and geopolitical intelligence. During the reign of Antoninus Pius, the Roman Empire experienced a phase of geopolitical stability that was almost unprecedented, marked by a notable absence of large-scale military campaigns, a reduction in armed conflicts along the borders, and the sophisticated, patient use of diplomacy as a tool of dominance and order maintenance. In a Roman world accustomed to measuring the glory of its emperors by territorial conquests and the number of defeated enemies, Antoninus challenged this logic with silent elegance, proving that ruling well did not necessarily require waging war. His diplomatic legacy lies precisely in what he avoided: bloodshed, public humiliations, regional instability, and unsustainable military expenses. His empire was maintained not by the power of the sword, but by the power of the word, symbolic imperial presence, and skillful diplomatic management of frontier interests. One of the great virtues of his foreign policy was the pragmatic recognition that not all threats require armed confrontation. Antoninus understood that, in many regions, especially along the northern frontiers with the Germanic and Danubian peoples, the presence of Roman legions functioned more as a deterrent than as an offensive force. He kept the garrisons well supplied and properly commanded, but avoided provoking them with expansionist advances. The construction of the so-called Antonine Wall, north of Britannia, although a punctual military incursion, functioned much more as a symbolic gesture of presence and visual domination than as a realistic attempt at territorial annexation. This wall, smaller and less robust than Hadrian's, was later abandoned, but its objective was not military. It was psychological, geographic, imperial. It served to remind the Caledonian peoples that Rome was watchful, but also knew how to retreat with dignity. In the eastern frontiers, his diplomacy was even more refined. When dealing with the Parthians, traditionally Rome's greatest eastern rivals, Antoninus adopted a stance of mutual respect and strategic vigilance. Instead of invading, he negotiated. Instead of sending legions, he sent messages. His policy consisted of maintaining the balance between power and non-intervention, not allowing the Parthians to grow too strong, but also not giving them reasons for open conflict. This approach guaranteed decades of peace in the eastern provinces, allowing the cities of Syria, Judea, and Cappadocia to flourish. Under his rule, Rome appeared less as a conquering empire and more as a stabilizing power, a constant presence that, although it did not advance, also never withdrew. His relationship with barbarian tribes and client kings also reveals Antoninus's diplomatic intelligence. He understood that many of these peripheral leaders sought Rome's support not merely out of fear, but for political convenience, symbolic prestige, and access to economic resources. By maintaining alliances with frontier tribes, vassal kingdoms, and local chieftains, the emperor prevented uprisings, reduced tensions, and expanded Roman influence in an indirect but effective way. Gifts, titles, grants of citizenship, and ceremonial recognition were used as tools of control. Peace was bought with honor, not through brutal imposition, and Rome, in this arrangement, became not just a military force, but a moral and institutional authority for those who desired order and continuity. Antoninus also understood the value of culture as a diplomatic tool. He promoted the construction of Roman temples in non-Roman cities, encouraged the teaching of Latin in the provinces, and sponsored the introduction of Roman legal forms among newly incorporated peoples. This cultural diplomacy, carried out not with weapons, but with books, monuments, and customs, expanded the Roman ideal far beyond physical borders. It was silent Romanization, not imposed by force, but voluntarily embraced by those who saw in the Roman model a pathway to ascension and prestige. The presence of Rome became desired, not feared. It is telling that throughout his long reign, Antoninus never personally led a military campaign. What many past historians once saw as weakness, today reveals itself as an elevated form of power. To govern without war, to maintain the empire without drawing swords, to engage in dialogue where others invaded, all this demands rare moral strength, deep confidence in the structures of the state, and a worldview centered on peace as superiority, not as weakness. His peace was not omission, it was active vigilance, intelligent restraint, and calculated influence. In the next block, we will examine how Antoninus prepared his succession, consolidating not only the transition to Marcus Aurelius, but also a model of dynastic continuity that would grant the empire, for a few more decades, its final golden age, before the long descent into the conflicts of the 3rd century. If there is a legacy that distinguishes Antoninus Pius as a statesman of rare clarity, it is his obsessive attention to succession. For him, the emperor was not merely a ruler of the present, but a guardian of the future, and preparing the transition of power was more than an administrative act. It was a political, moral, and institutional testament. By adopting Marcus Aurelius as his son and heir long before his death, and by educating him with intense philosophical, legal, and civic rigor, Antoninus projected a continuity based not merely on blood or authority, but on the formation of a spirit worthy of leading the Roman world. His simultaneous adoption of Lucius Verus was also a strategic move, ensuring that even after his death, Rome would not plunge into palace disputes, but would instead follow the steady course of an organized, legitimate, and stable dynasty. Antoninus not only entrusted Marcus Aurelius with the future of the empire, he shaped that future with his own hands. From an early age, Marcus was subjected to a demanding routine of philosophical study, senate sessions, rhetorical training, legal debates, historical readings, and moral instruction. Antoninus did not impose authority. He set an example. He created an environment in which power was not a privilege but a responsibility. The future emperor grew up seeing the throne not as a stage for personal glory, but as a space of sacrifice and duty. In long conversations with Stoic teachers, and in the administrative exercises assigned to him, Marcus learned to govern not with the sword, but with the mind, with the word, with reason. The empire, under the vigilant eyes of Antoninus, became a school of virtue. The choice of Marcus Aurelius as heir was not merely the result of affection, it was a deeply strategic decision. In a time when many emperors succumbed to the temptation of favoring unprepared biological sons, Antoninus remained loyal to the logic of adoptive imperial meritocracy inaugurated by Nerva and solidified by Trajan and Hadrian. What was transmitted was not just power, but an ideal of government, an empire without unnecessary wars, founded on justice, moderation, and administrative intelligence. Marcus, with his natural austerity, his philosophical sensibility, and his aversion to excess, was the perfect heir to that ethos. Even Lucius Verus, more inclined to public life and luxury, served as a useful counterbalance, a complementary face in the exercise of dual power, something Antoninus understood as a tool for stability and diffusion of internal tensions. The succession was announced gradually, without surprises or ruptures. The Roman people, the senatorial elites, and the provincial governors all were prepared over the years to recognize Marcus Aurelius as the inevitable figure of the next Caesar. Instead of pompous proclamations or populist speeches, Antoninus invested in silent symbols: the seat at the table, honorific titles, delegated responsibilities, Marcus's presence in key decisions. It was the pedagogy of succession, enacted in full view of the public, so that no one would question its legitimacy. When Antoninus finally fell ill, the empire already knew what would follow, and that was in itself a triumph of his policy. The succession occurred without conflict, without a coup, without crisis, something exceedingly rare in Roman history. The death of Antoninus, serene and discreet, was accompanied by one of the clearest political testaments of the imperial period. Not only did it name Marcus and Lucius as co-emperors, but it also outlined counsels, instructions, and administrative provisions that revealed his care for continuity. Unlike emperors who died amid wars or conspiracies, Antoninus departed, leaving everything in order. His reign ended as it began, in peace. And more than that, he left behind a successor not merely prepared to rule, but morally ready to embody the spirit of virtuous Rome. In the next block, we will analyze the impact of the death of Antoninus Pius and his official deification by the Senate, exploring how his legacy was consecrated not only in historical memory, but also in the imperial cult and in the collective consciousness of an empire that, even in silence, knew how to recognize greatness. Antoninus Pius died in the year 161 after Christ at 74, following an unusually long reign marked by internal peace, economic prosperity, and ethical governance. His death, unlike many predecessors who perished amid conspiracies, poisonings, or wars, occurred peacefully at his residence in Lorium, Etruria. He was surrounded by servants, advisors, and family. It is said his final words were simple and calm, a perfect reflection of the life he led: balanced, prudent, without excess. His passing was not merely the end of a rule, it was the closure of a silent golden age, recognized only in retrospect as the empire plunged into decades of turmoil. Shortly after his death, the Roman Senate, in an almost unanimous display of institutional reverence, proposed and approved his dual official deification, elevating Antoninus to the pantheon of the Divi, emperors venerated as gods after death. This act was not purely religious, it was profoundly political. Deifying an emperor meant publicly acknowledging that his life had exemplified civic virtue, stability, and service to Roman order. The title Divus Antoninus did more than adorn coins and altars. It became a moral declaration of what Rome valued in a ruler. In his case, it was not spilled blood or conquered lands, but constancy, prudence, and concern for internal harmony. The cult of Divus Antoninus gained strength largely through his association with Faustina, his wife, also deified. The temple of Antoninus and Faustina in the Roman Forum became one of the greatest symbols of that union between personal love, public duty, and civic veneration. There, the couple was honored not merely as sovereigns, but as archetypes of marital integrity and political stability. This temple, which to this day stands majestically with its columns, served as a daily reminder to Romans: a well-governed empire begins with a well-ordered household. Embedded in the temple's architecture was the pedagogy of power that Antoninus embodied: balance, fidelity, permanence. Posthumous coins also helped fix his image as an emperor of order. Instead of displaying warlike scenes or triumphant figures, they celebrated abstract virtues, pietas, Constantia, Concordia, Justitia, Antoninus became the symbol of all Rome aspired to be, especially in uncertain times. His figure was evoked by senators and jurists as a model of integrity, by provincial administrators as an exemplar of rationality, by philosophers as a reflection of harmony between power and wisdom. No other emperor who had not waged war or expanded the frontiers was so widely admired for preserving what already existed, protecting inherited Rome rather than transforming it brutally. Even Marcus Aurelius, his heir and one of the most cultured and reflective emperors, always referred to Antoninus with almost filial reverence. In his Meditations, Marcus dedicates several passages to remembering his adoptive father, praising not only his deeds but his character: temperance, patience with others' faults, refusal to avenge, respect for traditions, love of justice. To Marcus, Antoninus was more than an administrative exemplar. He was the emperor-philosopher without speeches, who lived what others merely preached. His deification in that sense was not just a posthumous right, it was recognition of what he already embodied in life. A man who governed as if in service to something greater, not his own glory, but to Rome's eternity. Antoninus Pius thus became an almost mythic reference. His death sealed not only a reign, but a style of rule that would grow increasingly rare. His memory would transcend centuries as a breath of normality amid the storm of future emperors. In the next and final section of this screenplay, we will trace the historical judgment of Antoninus over the centuries, analyzing how his figure was interpreted by chroniclers, jurists, philosophers, and historians, and why, although one of the most overlooked emperors in popular celebration, he remains one of the most respected by those who truly understand power.